Thanks all for coming. You may recognize me from Magnum PI. Really, I'm a visiting tutor at St. John's and a research fellow at Santa Fe Institute, so I'd like to thank both institutions for allowing me to write this lecture and give it. Specifically, here at St. John's, I'd like to thank President Walter Sterling, Dean Sarah Davis, Associate Dean David Carl, and Michael Foote, plus Richard. Let me move this over.
Yes, there you go.
Richard McCombs. Can everyone hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
And all the other faculty and staff. And at Santa Fe Institute, I'd like to thank David Krakauer, Chris Kempes, and my wife, Caitlin McShea. Caitlin often listens to portions of my talks and tells me which sentences to eliminate. I'd like to thank my parents, too, and my aunt. Finally, I'd like to thank Robert Gambiner, who's here in the audience, for recommending Under Western Eyes to me roughly a year ago. He recommended it the same week as one of my colleagues at Santa Fe Institute did, so I take that as a true doubling. One disclaimer, traditionally St. John's lectures are about a single text, and like the seminar, you don't really bring in too much outside material. You try to excavate the meaning around a single idea or a group or a cluster of ideas or a passage, and you work hard at doing that. You don't make too many references, don't bring in too much historical context. But because this is a dual lecture, in part written at Santa Fe Institute, in part written for today, and because this is a summer lecture, it's a little less formal, so I'm breaking the rules a little bit. The talk is entitled Seeing Double, Rereading Joseph Conrad's Under Western Eyes. Roughly a century ago, upon learning of Joseph Conrad's death, H.L. Mencken wrote, "There have been perhaps greater novelists, but I believe that Conrad was incomparably the greatest artist who ever wrote a novel." It is safe to assume Mencken was comparing Joseph Conrad to writers like Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, Dickens and Austen, Hugo and Balzac. But how could these writers be lesser artists than Conrad while being superior novelists, if the novel is an art form? One would expect the greater novelists to be the greater artists. The mystery, I think, is clarified if we look at a comment Jorge Luis Borges made some 13 years later in an essay on William Faulkner. "I know of two kinds of writers, those whose central preoccupation is verbal technique, and those for whom it is human acts and passions. Among the great novelists, Conrad was perhaps the last who was interested both in the techniques of the novel and in the fates and personalities of his characters." It may be that this was what Mencken was getting at, that the novel as novel concerns human acts, passions, and conflicts, whereas the novel as art form concerns the mortal element expressed through the sort of techniques we detect more readily in music, painting, and sculpture. Form, structure, counterpoint, voice, chiaroscuro, texture, brushstroke, and so on. Conrad's finest works, and most of his works are very fine, from the short stories to the novellas to the full-blown novels, begin with innovative narrative approaches and only slowly drift into the gravity and folly of the individual character under intense pressure. It is for this reason that each specific story he wrote is difficult to get into, but then almost impossible to put down. As plenty of critics have noted, Conrad employed a new style and a new method of narration for each tale, thereby challenging the reader to adapt to his authorial innovations just to perceive the rudiments of plot, personage, and setting. Compare, say, the temporal shifts in the opening chapter of The Secret Agent with the fact that we really first learn about the main characters in Typhoon through the idiosyncratic letters they write home from abroad. Or think of the envelope narratives of Heart of Darkness and how their semiotic relation differs from that of the duplicated narratives comprising Under Western Eyes. One could even spend a lovely and worthwhile afternoon attempting to map the weird structure of Lord Jim. Few writers can tell such gripping stories while elevating the procedures of the novel and demanding serious interpretation on the part of an audience. Conrad's own two-pronged talent as artist and novelist casts every reader in a double role as both engrossed spectator and active interpreter, and this in turn captures one of the mysterious contradictions of literature more generally, the fact that the best of it entails the opposing effects of escapism and critical reflection. Readers are near to and far from the action at the same time, in a process sometimes called the antinomy of distance. How strange it is that a single tale can sweep you away to the deck of a ship under duress, or a seedy London street, only to cause you, in the same moment, to ponder the vexations and achievements of the individual will, to ask questions concerning the nature of human incomprehension and moral solitude, to inquire into the predicaments of identity, to consider one punctured illusion after another, as well as all the quirks of time, fate, death, deception, love, blindness, evil, and the contending forces of the universe. In Conrad, even language itself assumes a double role, becoming both too much and not enough. Language is at once the primary resource for communal meaning and the main occasion for social confusion. It is the apparent vehicle for truth, but also truth's feeble pallbearer. Under Western Eyes opens with a claim to this effect when one of the book's two narrators, a linguist, comments upon being lost in the overwhelming wilderness of words. Words, as is well known, are the great foes of reality. To a teacher of languages, there comes a time when the world is but a place of many words, and man appears a talking animal not much more wonderful than a parrot. This frustration with language's unkept promise is probably familiar to any Heart of Darkness aficionado who recalls how the inner, or second narrator of that story, Marlowe, is constantly remarking upon the insufficiency of language to communicate his own experience. No, it is impossible. It is impossible to convey the life sensation of any given epoch of one's existence. That which makes its truth, its meaning, its subtle and penetrating essence. It is impossible. We live as we dream, alone. And yet Marlowe continues the attempt to relate his experience to his nautical companions, at one point going so far as to praise the unbounded power of eloquence, of words, of burning noble words. Conrad understood these double aspects of storytelling, reading, and language, in part because he recognized the double nature of almost everything, himself included. He commented on this at the opening of a short essay entitled Flight, when he wrote, "I fairly call myself an amphibian." He was referring to the fact that he spent half of his active life at sea, that he lived twixt land and sea, to name one of his short story collections. Yet this amphibiousness is not limited to the literal sense of being both terrestrial and aquatic. In fact, it applies to every other aspect of his life. In the most obvious example, he became proper master of two different realms, seafaring and storytelling. We've already glossed the double possibilities of storytelling, but the same holds for captaining a vessel. Conrad qualified as captain of the British Merchant Marine in 1886, and as Lionel Trilling once pointed out, a captain is a master in a dual sense, both an expert in the craft of the ship, the individual on board with the greatest knowledge and qualifications, and the leader, the absolute authority whose orders are disobeyed at the risk of severe punishment or death. Each side of Conrad's amphibious nature was itself a double. Still, these are only the most superficial of reasons to attribute a fractal amphibiousness to Conrad the man. It's not merely that to this day he enjoys a double legacy, being cast by some as the liberal-minded vivisector of colonial dehumanization, and by others as the racist we must read to understand why we must not read him. Chinua Achebe's rather brilliant 1977 essay, An Image of Africa, kick-started the industry called post-colonial criticism by claiming that Conrad was a formidable talent and a foolish bigot. Yet Conrad was the man who, even before Roger Casement, opened the public's eyes to the brutalities of the Belgian looting of the Congo, who first chronicled the rise of globalism with all its dirty practices and collateral damages, and who claimed, when many were trying to conceal the fact, that there was common humanity between the civilized European and the savage African. There is simply no way around the fact that Conrad was somehow a provincial man of the globe, a writer who had aired atrocities happening to people both like and unlike him, who at the same time was seduced by those atrocities, just as his fictional surrogate Marlowe in Heart of Darkness is simultaneously appalled by and enamored with the vicious ivory trader Kurtz. All the while, both Conrad and Marlowe refused to countenance the idea that the death of one native African was worth that man who was the deranged product of all European so-called civilization and progress. Nor can Conrad's amphibiousness be reduced to the fact that he straddled 2 centuries, being a product of the 19th and a prophet of the 20th. He wrote great books in the 8th century, works that are still worth reading after his death centennial has whizzed by. Born Joseph Theodor Conrad Korzeniowski to Polish parents in 1857 in what is now Ukraine but was then under the control of the Russian Empire, at age 26 he became a British subject and anglicized himself as Joseph Conrad. Thus, he became a man with 2 names and 2 identities. His father, Apollo, was a radical Polish nationalist who throughout Conrad's early youth plotted revolutionary activity against the Tsarist autocracy he felt had usurped his land and heritage. Eventually arrested for conspiracy and agitation, Apollo was imprisoned in the famous Warsaw Citadel in 1861 when the author was just 4 years old. Less than a year later, Apollo was convicted without trial, and the entire Korzeniowski family was exiled with him to an inhospitable region of northern Russia. Conrad's first memories were of bondage and exile, the damp and the cold, of hardship and isolation. As a youth, he was embittered by the rapid onset of the tuberculosis that would take first his mother in 1865, when the boy was only 7, and next his father in 1869. As a result of this early life of homelessness, illness, despair, solitude, and eventual orphanage, he would forever be divided between his disdain for autocracy and his contempt for revolutionary activity, believing both to be at play in his misery. Much of his mature political writing demonstrates a deep sense that extreme ideologies compose an Ouroboros in relation to each other, with head and tail composing a single, yet divided unit of cyclical self-destruction and doomed rebirth. Conrad can also be examined with reference to a title of his short masterpiece, The Shadow Line. In his books, everything falls under shadow lines, those blurred boundaries between two otherwise unambiguous states, between autocracy and revolution, yes, but also between maturity and innocence, sanity and madness, bondage and liberty, barbarism and civilization, solidarity and discord. Most shadowy of all is the line we call the present, which eternally separates the past and the future with shades of uncertainty cast in each direction, one called memory and the other called hope. What is more, shadow is Conrad's favorite noun, and shadowy his favorite adjective. If you don't believe me, read any of his books and underline each appearance of those words. After all, the shadow is always a duplicated, negative image of something else. In 1903, in a letter to a friend, Conrad called himself homo duplex, which has, in my case, he added, more than one meaning. And it would be fair to say that he thought of the human being in general as a homo duplex, even if we mistakenly call ourselves homo sapiens. What we think of as the personality is only a dark and solitary region between incompatible attitudes. It was this idea that he applied to all his work as an author. The only legitimate basis of creative work, he wrote in 1901, lies in the courageous recognition of all the irreconcilable antagonisms that make our life so enigmatic, so burdensome, so fascinating, so dangerous, so full of hope. One of the indelible conceits across most of Conrad's fiction is the figure of the double, the mysterious self-division or self-multiplication that is unable to coalesce into an individual, an undivided self. At times, one person develops two identities. At times, two people share the same identity. In both directions, consciousness is nothing more than the shadow line between internal antagonisms that can neither merge nor separate. Among all of Conrad's stories, the one that most strikingly evokes the double is The Secret Sharer, in which an untried captain, who despite his full authority feels himself a stranger to the ship and crew under his command, sees his own perfect doppelganger emerge naked from the darkened waters of the Gulf of Siam. You get feedback? The whole time?
No.
Let's put it back. Before this, can you still hear me?
Yes.
Before this uncanny arrival, the captain already felt self-divided. I was somewhat of a stranger to myself, the youngest man on board, barring the second mate, and untried as yet by a position of the fullest responsibility. I was willing to take the adequacy of others for granted. They had simply to be equal to their tasks. But I wondered how far I should turn out to be faithful to that ideal conception of one's own personality every man sets up for himself secretly. In the ensuing pages, Conrad does little to mask the principal conceit. The captain dresses the newcomer in pajamas identical to his own, remarking how similar their features are even aside from their clothing. He refers to the man, an escaped murderer from another ship, as his double as many as 12 times, calling him also my other self, my secret self, and my secret sharer. He claims that he and his secret sharer have identical attitudes, and says things like, I felt more dual than ever. Meanwhile, the title itself has a double meaning. The escaped murderer shares his secret with the captain, but he's also a twin whose presence the captain keeps secret from the other sailors. Conrad was not alone in chronicling human duplicity, of course. However we choose to date modernity, this notion of the human being as a contradiction, or an ambivalent and ambiguous bundle of contradictions and paradoxes, is central to almost any writer, artist, or thinker we call modern, whether Shakespeare, Cervantes, Baudelaire, or Beckett. Octavio Paz once claimed that Petrarch, who wrote in the 14th century, was the first modern poet, by which he meant the first to be aware of his own contradictions and the first to transform them into the substance of poetry. In this sense, the label of modern applies to the spiritual condition of self-alienation rather than the strict time period of an author's work. Rightly then, when Colm Tóibín wrote of Joseph Conrad that because he kept his doubleness intact, he remains our contemporary, he was getting at the idea that Conrad was not only aware of his own amphibiousness, but was also able to emphasize with his imagination the notion that all of us are dual and self-contradictory, governed by oppositions we often refuse to acknowledge. To put it more bluntly, modernism, and Conrad's modernism especially, is in part the recognition of the human being as a contradiction that cannot be resolved or unified. Over time, wrote the Hungarian modernist Miklós Szentkuthi, an adult gets used to the fact that he is, in point of fact, a self-contradiction and loitering absurdity. And Szentkuthi had certainly read as Rousseau, who suggested in the second discourse that the human soul is not a majestic simplicity made in the image of an eternal author, but the grotesque contrast of passion, which thinks it reasons. Later on, Kierkegaard claimed that existence first begins with contradiction. And in the same notebook, as long as I live in contradiction, for life is contradiction. Let me propose that the coexistence in the psyche of the life drive, or eros, with the death drive, or thanatos, that Freud is credited with formulating, is merely the most intense manifestation of a more general network of contradictions latent in every one of us. We form our strongest convictions in times of deepest uncertainty, and we are all both senselessly gullible and wildly suspicious. Falsehood is appealing to the intellect as truth. We yearn for peace but leave a wake of violence. We are capable of both good and evil, and are as likely to damage as protect ourselves. The law of self-destruction and the law of self-preservation are equally strong in mankind, as a Dostoevsky character once put it. We come to resent what we admire. We think abstractly but must act concretely, and we are all at once rationally informed and irrationally driven. We feel self-love and self-loathing simultaneously, and while we long to stand above the crowd, we long also to disappear into it. We cherish victimhood as much as privilege, punishment as much as lenience. We seek out suffering as eagerly as joy. Often our disappointments are commingled with relief. We pursue both novelty and repetition. Pride and shame are inextricable. We strive for independence while desiring to disavow all accountability, and we want power without the weight of executive responsibility. We are simultaneously free and determined. We purposely intensify our own sour moods to heighten their influence and our own sense of righteousness, and we constantly do the opposite of what we say, even when we meant what we said just a moment ago. We use words both to inform and to deceive. We wish to remove our veneers, yet we loathe to be naked and revealed. We have an aspiration to communicate our inner selves entirely while also refusing to release our special secrets. And we grow hostile towards those confessors to whom we have unburdened our hearts too profusely. Possibilities, dreams, and fantasies enrich our lives, but the moment of realization is inevitably accompanied by the inexpressible sorrow and the sense of fleetingness or loss. Worst of all, we are capable of self-deception and self-betrayal. Just this fact that we can lie to ourselves and betray ourselves is cause for infinite wonder, even to the point of madness. As Mikhail Bakhtin once remarked, a man never coincides with himself. One cannot apply to him the formula of identity A equals A. Perhaps this is why Montaigne, often called the first modern, suggested that the better we know ourselves, the less we understand ourselves. 2.5 centuries after him, Hegel wrote in his lectures on aesthetics, the modern intellect produces this opposition in man which makes him an amphibious animal. Because now he must live in two worlds which contradict one another. The result is that consciousness wanders about in this contradiction and, driven from one side to the other, cannot find satisfaction for itself in either the one or the other. But for modern culture and its intellect, this discordance in life and consciousness involves the demand that such a contradiction be resolved. Yet while Hegel claims that his own philosophy achieves this resolution, he was unable to convince many of his more critical readers. As a philosopher, he was better at diagnosis than treatment. And this failure is one reason why it is no coincidence that between the time of Hegel's writing and now, so many indisputably fascinating works of art have been devoted to the figure of the double, and why almost every work by that amphibious homo duplex Joseph Conrad evokes doubleness, duplication, and duplicity to a lesser or greater degree. If Hegel had resolved the modern human condition of self-contradiction, modern spirited art and literature would have died away, and with it our obsession with the double would have expired, or else returned to its more homely folkloric roots. But as everyone knows, the problem is almost irresolvable, since all subjective experience suggests to me that I am the center of the universe, yet I am simultaneously aware that I am completely marginal, irrelevant, subject to death, and insignificant, while the world outside of me is radically other than what my experience probably suggests. The trope of the double stretches back to Gilgamesh, to both of Homer's epics, to Genesis, to the many tales of Narcissus and his watery reflection, to the Greek myth of Castor and Pollux, the so-called Gemini, and to the Roman myth of two-faced Janus, to say nothing of the great fairy tales. Often in the earliest literature and scripture, however, and through the Middle Ages, the double in question acts as an allegorical foil or complement to the hero, rather than what we see developing in modern literature, where the double assumes the stature of the full-on existential doppelganger. The double is no longer a clue to some hidden wisdom, but in fact the source of all mystery and bafflement. As the novel developed in Europe as the art form that dealt not with kings, dukes, nobles, or great warriors, but with the common man or woman seeking purchase in a decentralized, confusing, dynamic, and presumably infinite universe, the double became an ever more explicit trope for exploring the implications of the individual's alienated consciousness, disenchantment, solitude, or lost unity, given that the replicated or repeated figure is at once foreign and familiar, repulsive and alluring. Consider the following great modern works about doubles, to name just a few. Edgar Allan Poe's William Wilson, Dostoevsky's The Double, Robert Louis Stevenson's The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray, Michel Tournier's Gemini, Tarjei Vesaas' The Ice Palace, Daphne du Maurier's The Scapegoat, most of Faulkner's best novels, Borges and I by Jorge Luis Borges, Italo Calvino's The Cloven Viscount, Philip K. Dick's A Scanner Darkly, Thomas Tryon's The Other, Philip Roth's Operation Shylock, Jose Saramago's The Double, and Orhan Pamuk's The White Castle. Not to mention almost every good detective story, in which the consciousness of the pursuer is tasked with duplicating the consciousness of the pursued, thereby showing the proximity between virtue and wickedness, heroism and sociopathy, crime and lawfulness. One can even think of ghost stories as tales of the double, since the ghost is an absent present or a present absence, at once the remainder of a once living person and something very different from the original. And in the best ghost stories like Henry James' The Turn of the Screw, it is unclear whether the haunting is real or merely the projection of a living character's fractured, paranoid psyche. The question, then, is how Conrad differs from these other authors in employing his doubles. This is to say, what makes Conrad stand out among all the other writers of doubles? It will come as no surprise that there are two obvious responses here. The first refers to what Borges said of Conrad, that he was the last great writer to exemplify the twin talents of character expression and formal technique. Conrad's fiction deals in characters who are schizoid, but also his formal approaches often reinforce the psychological division or multiplication, with more technical doubling such as mirrored narratives, tandem storytellers, and language that repeats itself. Conrad's doubleness runs so deep that it can often be hard to tell whether what we are dealing with is imaginative psychology or simply artistic technique. The line between these gets very shadowy. Take Heart of Darkness. That novella features two rivers, the Thames and the Congo, with two main vessels, one steam and one sail. It has two narrators, one reticent, the other verbose. We meet once and are later reminded of two knitting ladies who bear a remarkable resemblance to the Fates. It tells of one trip up the Congo looking for Kurtz, one trip back with Kurtz aboard. Kurtz himself has a double nature, one version that emerged in his mature life before visiting Africa, the other emerging at the heart of the African continent. Upon returning to England after being spellbound by Kurtz, Marlowe has a double vision of civilization, a double vision so perplexing that he cannot help lying to protect civilization's illusion to one audience, a single woman, and later telling the truth to destroy its illusion to another audience, a group of sailors. Furthermore, the irony that overwhelms Marlowe's narrative constitutes a double attitude towards everything it touches and describes, being at once profoundly concerned and stoically resigned. Of course, the most memorable line from that book is a rhetorical double, the horror, a phrase that is somehow both whispered and screamed, as Marlowe tells us. In rhetoric, we call this type of verbal duplication palologia. But palologia is used for emphasis, whereas I read Kurtz's final words not only as emphasis, but also as an acknowledgement of twin horrors, the horror within and the horror without, or the horror that Kurtz found he was capable of, and the horror of the universe he inhabited. Of course, all this doubling does not fully account for the thematic amplitude of Heart of Darkness, though note how the title itself, as with The Secret Share, has a double meaning. But a readerly recognition of it somehow both intensifies the book's inscrutability and provides a key to our comprehension. And comprehension concerning Heart of Darkness is always the comprehension of an enigma, or an acknowledged incomprehension. And this brings us to the second response to why Conrad's obsession with doubleness separates him from the other modern spirited authors I mentioned, as well as why his work is as relevant today as when it was written. In his later works, Conrad elevated the idea of the double from a figure of spiritual malaise to a figure of political rot. While most literary doubles present the reader with a psychological riddle, Conrad's grasp of how doubling can lead to terrible politics and how terrible politics can lead to doubling elevated his sense of it to the sphere of global intrigue, where dissembling, disguise, deception, and duplicity are the norms. This is particularly true of two novels he wrote back-to-back, already mentioned, The Secret Agent in 1907 and Under Western Eyes in 1911, both of which concern acts of political violence and early forms of domestic terrorism. Both are books drenched with deceit and betrayal, and both explore how these issues arise from and generate political systems that accomplish the opposite of their stated purposes in a never-ending feedback loop of hypocrisy and inverted means and ends. Verloc, the protagonist of The Secret Agent, is an agent provocateur, which is a fancy term for a double agent. He is a mediocre man who pretends to be an anarchist, but is really reporting to an unnamed authoritarian government, presumably Russia. His mission is to bomb the Greenwich Observatory and create such an outrage amongst the British public that they demand their government respond by becoming more reactionary and authoritarian. In other words, Verloc is forced to create a sense of anarchy to instigate desire for its suppression. Verloc is a double agent in the deepest sense. His cell of anarchist comrades also publishes radical leftist pamphlets. And while the authoritarian ambassador he ultimately answers to compels Verloc to double himself in this way, it is Verloc's aimlessness, mediocrity, and cowardice that facilitate the doubling of the larger authoritarian regime he serves. For they would not be able to carry out their contradictory plan of sowing chaos to create order were it not for the craven human individual's ability to dissimulate. Not only does Verloc become the individual representative of his party's duplicity, but also the party itself becomes a contradictory entity, a mirror image of itself, bringing about the thing it most fears in order to avoid the fruition of that fear. Collateral damage becomes irrelevant, and the collateral damage is there in abundance. As a result of his obedience and secrecy, Verloc brings about the destruction of his family and the slaughter of his innocent brother-in-law, and ultimately inspires his wife to do the most unwifely thing imaginable, murder her husband. In The Secret Agent, one character voices Conrad's belief that political institutions beget their own mirror images. Like to like, he says, the terrorist and the policeman both come from the same basket. Revolutions, legality, countermoves in the same game. Forms of idleness at bottom identical. Conrad himself, in the author's note to Under Western Eyes, expands this thought. The ferocity and imbecility of an autocratic rule rejecting all legality, and in fact, basing itself upon a complete moral anarchism, provokes the no less imbecile and atrocious answer of a purely utopian revolutionism encompassing destruction by the first means to hand. These people are unable to see that all they can effect is merely a change of names. The oppressors and oppressed are all Russians together. One is reminded of something Simone Weil wrote 3 decades later. How many times in Germany in 1932 might a communist and a Nazi conversing in the street have been struck by the sort of mental vertigo on discovering they were in complete agreement on all issues? It seems that in Conrad's work, every active system, from the solitary individual to society writ large, creates its own evil twin, or else learns how to mirror itself to multiply its own perceived relevance. And every text is an attempt to replicate a prior text, if only to enhance the original's mysteries. Under Western Eyes, by Conrad's own admission, is in part about how political regimes give birth to their own doubles. One recalls in reading the novel that Conrad blamed his father's revolutionary activity as much as the despotic regime he conspired against for the sufferings of his own childhood. Under Western Eyes betrays a deep sense of Conrad's two-pronged loathing, since he treats the Russian revolutionaries and the authoritarian Russian government with equal mockery and disdain. It is a single people, a single Russia divided against itself. Each party is totalitarian in its methods, dogmatic, despotic, suspicious, spying, self-infatuated, self-serving, treacherous, and willing to do violence to its own members whenever the urge arises. It seems that the savage autocracy, the teacher of language tells us at the end of the book, any more than the divine democracy, does not limit its diet exclusively to the bodies of its enemies. It devours its friends and servants as well. Under Western Eyes is the story of Razumov, an orphan and university student living in complete solitude in St. Petersburg. His only aim in life is to become integrated in Russian society by winning a silver medal for his scholarship and later becoming a respected professor. As the story opens, he is unwittingly entangled in revolutionary politics when a fellow student, Victor Halden, assassinates a high government official and seeks refuge in Razumov's apartment. Though Razumov has no sympathy for revolutionary causes, his reserved and private nature inspires a misguided confidence among the more radical, action-oriented university students. He finds himself forced to make a fateful decision between helping Victor Halden escape Petersburg or betraying him to the authorities. Within a few hours, he decides on betrayal, leading to Halden's capture, interrogation, and swift execution. From that point on, the autocrats suspect Razumov of being a radical sympathizer, given the fact that Victor Halden trusted and confided in him just after assassinating the minister. He is left with no option but to act as the instrument of the autocrats and to aid the Russian secret police by infiltrating revolutionary circles in Geneva, where a plot is brewing to instigate violent insurrection in the Baltics. There in Geneva, he encounters Victor Halden's sister, Natalia, who mistakes him for her brother's trusted friend. She wants to know only one thing from Razumov, the one thing he cannot confess to her, namely whether her brother was betrayed or whether he gave up hope willingly and willingly died for the revolutionary cause. She cannot imagine her brother not attempting to escape to Geneva to rejoin his family, and she cannot bear to think that he gave up hope for his own future. The irony of the situation, of Razumov being revered and trusted by the family of the man he betrayed, and being tasked with betraying the family still further, creates ever more intense double binds for Razumov. As he grows closer to Natalia, he finds he is in love with her and her trustful eyes. She sees him as the man he wishes he was. He becomes increasingly consumed by guilt and the psychological burdens of his deception. Eventually, he confesses to Natalia his role in Victor's capture. This revelation destroys his relationship with her as well as his standing among the revolutionaries, who, like Natalia, had mistakenly assumed he was Victor Halden's accomplice and thus a revolutionary hero. They brutally assault him, the revolutionaries do, leaving him deaf and permanently crippled. He spends the rest of his days in a small town in southern Russia, dying slowly under the care of a woman named Tekla, who likewise had been abused by the revolutionaries. This is a bare summary of what happens, but I think it hardly touches on what the novel is really about. If we think about what Borges and Mencken said of Conrad, then this summary concerns the book's status as a novel, but not its power as a work of art. The language of Under Western Eyes, its structure, its recurring images and motifs, its shifts in perspective, and the ways its surfaces all hint at its unfathomable depths, all seem to concern the contradictoriness, the doubleness of human existence at every scale, from the individual psyche to the global clash of political systems and movements. And it is Conrad's masterful artistry that saturates the mind of the attentive reader with so much doubleness, so that ultimately one cannot help but inquire as to the duplicity of all the characters and groups who inhabit it, and bring it to its inexorable, ironic conclusion. The most important structural doubling to know about is that the text itself is narrated by the man I mentioned already, the one who calls himself an English teacher of languages, who admits on page 1 that what he's writing is in fact a retelling of Razumov's secret diary. That is, the novel pretends to be the double of an altogether different manuscript we never get full access to. And this explains the title. The Englishman's Western eyes have seen an Eastern story, and his language is merely parroting it. One of the narrator's constant refrains is the claim that he does not understand the Eastern perspective, and thus he constantly reminds us that there are always two types of eyes, each incomprehensible and antagonistic to the other. Still, despite his claim, he spends over 300 pages doing just that, understanding Eastern eyes. And on the topic of eyes, furthermore, almost everyone in the story is spying on everyone else. And to spy is to bifurcate one's identity into spectator and participant. which is something even the innocuous-seeming narrator is clearly doing in almost every scene in which he plays a part. Still further, the novel masks itself as inartistic, as unimaginative, a mere record of real events, when in fact it is entirely artistic, wholly imaginative, a record of events that never happened. The events take place in two cities, Petersburg and Geneva, and we spend almost the same time span in each. And just when the reader thinks the narration is moving forward to the conclusion, it doubles back in time and fills the gaps of our knowledge about how Razumov was conscripted by the secret police. In performing my due diligence for this lecture, to make sure I was not inadvertently parroting extant scholarship, I came across the following paragraph, written by a scholar named Pensitya, which enumerates better than I could many of the other doublings that structure the novel. As the major theme of the novel is duplicity, the characteristic feature of its construction is doubleness or duplication. Razumov's masquerade fractures him into a double man who speaks in two voices, one to the revolutionaries, one to himself, a voice that comes to us through what the language teacher heard, a voice from Razumov's diary. It is not accidental that the novel is filled with images of doubling, mirrors, masks, shadows, echoes, phantoms. Events, places, people unsettlingly recur. The dark mist of Geneva reduplicates the dark snowstorm of St. Petersburg. Natalia reincarnates Halden. The beating of Ziminich is atoned for in the beating of Razumov. Halden's prostrate form on Razumov's bed, hands over his eyes, reappears as the phantom in the snow, and then as Razumov himself, lying here like that man. Halden's pale figure drawn asunder on the rack becomes an image of Razumov's suffering brain. The events of the fateful day opening the novel are replayed in a compulsive ritual in which Razumov takes Halden's part, and in a similar ritual, the night of the confession plays out again the night of the betrayal, as the facts and the words of a certain evening of his past were timing Razumov's conduct in the present. Doubleness, duplication, duplicity are the signatures in the novel's genetic code. Because extreme politics on both sides always entail surveillance, everyone in the novel engages in both pathological suspicion and doublespeak. No one can be trusted because no one trusts, and vice versa. Razumov often equivocates by telling the truth in a false context, suggesting the opposite of what he means. As when he says to a prominent revolutionary that his mission is dictated by necessity and by a sense of retributive justice. Both claims are true for him as a spy, not as a revolutionary. But she, the revolutionary, takes him to mean the inverse. A moment later, we learn that it gave him a feeling of triumphant pleasure to deceive her out of her own mouth. The epigrammatic saying that speech has been given to us for concealing our thoughts came to his mind. Meanwhile, the supposedly inspired leader of the revolutionary circle is world famous for being a devoted feminist. But in private quarters, as everyone knows, he indentures women, abuses them, and makes them his puppets. He has no true concern for revolution or for women, but only for developing a widening circle of acolytes and wealthy benefactors who can keep him in luxury. And as it turns out, the brute who permanently wounds and deafens Razumov, as punishment for his espionage, is also a double agent, working for the same regime that had conscripted Razumov. His act of maiming Razumov is, for him, just an act, a performance. Still, it is Razumov who is the true double agent of the story, a man who becomes consumed by the destructive power of his own duplicated self. Prior to Victor Halden's arrival in his apartment on the day of the assassination, Razumov was, as I have said, truly solitary. Yet he was already doubled between his true self and his future or ideal self. And a young man in this relation to an ideal is in some sense a divided being, as Lionel Trilling once said of an earlier Conrad work. He stands apart from himself to take his own measure. He exists both as an actual self and the self he aspires to be. The time will come when he will, as the phrase goes, find himself. But until then, his conduct may well be checked and hampered by the division in his being. When Victor Halden seeks out Razumov's help, Razumov does not turn to his conscience to navigate the double bind of giving help to a murderer or becoming an indirect murderer himself. Moral courage plays no role in his decision whatsoever. It is loyalty to his ideal self, that is, his projected yet to exist self, that directs his decision to betray Halden. Being already divided, he abandons the continuity of his conscience for the dream of respectability and social integration. The great irony is that the decision leads to his own disintegration, to the inability to consolidate himself or become a part of a community, so that everywhere he goes, he is alone with his secret, forced to split his tongue in two, fated to betray others more and more. This is why he says, towards the very end of the book, as he completes his confession to the only woman who ever showed him affection, It was myself, after all, whom I betrayed most basely. Yet in the act of confession, he finally coincides with himself, finally tells the truth, and finally overcomes his own self-division. Tragically, the confession leaves him an invalid. Perhaps comically, it allows him to unite with someone who wants to love him eternally, the same Tekla who had been abused by the revolutionaries, the woman who is his double in suffering. Conrad was so effective as the 20th century's first great political novelist, I think, because of his awareness of how the contradictory nature of the human individual mind sets the conditions for bad faith politics, and how bad faith politics only promote further doubling. Whereas most of the famous stories of the double I already mentioned are psychological, meaning pertaining to the neuroses or psychoses of a single individual, Conrad actually recognizes the doubling capacity of our minds as the universal condition. It is anthropological rather than psychological. To put it differently, those more famous stories of the double are told of an individual in solitude. Whether the solitude is self-imposed, dictated by position, such as that of a captain or prisoner, or the result of ostracization, exile, ridicule, scandal, or debilitating insecurity, it remains the case that mental or physical isolation generates identity duplexes. This may be obvious to anyone who has ever conversed or argued with himself or herself while alone. And yet the proliferation of doubles in literature took off at a time of urban flourishing, when people had never been more jammed together, suggesting that very often excessive physical proximity breeds mental solitude. This too may be obvious to anyone who has ever lived in a city and felt greater anonymity there than a prior or subsequent life spent in a small town. Conrad knows the other side of this. Specifically, he knows that our ability to deceive ourselves, to think we are reasoning soundly when our mind is merely suppressing conflicting passions, plus our penchant for convincing ourselves we are acting with moral purpose when beneath the surface is a seething moral chaos, seem to combine, when taken in a population-level aggregate, to an instinctive hypocrisy exploitable by the surveillance purveyors and fearmongers nearest at hand. At the slightest hint of a moral conundrum, we abandon the stronger halves of ourselves. We betray ourselves. We deceive ourselves into thinking that the quieter sides of our natures are the weaker ones, when in fact the opposite may be true. This is probably why Conrad wrote in his memoir, A Personal Record, "It would take too long to explain the intimate alliance of contradictions in human nature, which makes love itself wear at times the desperate shape of betrayal." His point includes, I would suggest, both self-love and self-betrayal, each of which requires the self to diverge into subject and object. We'll close by insisting that Under Western Eyes is a novel to be read twice. The first for its novelistic qualities, and the second for its artistic ones. Or better, the first time with Western eyes and the second with Eastern eyes. Or better yet, the first time with repugnance and the second with sympathy. Or best of all, the first time as yourself and the second as your double. Thank you.